In 1941, the Dutch fleet in the Dutch East Indies seemed hopeless against the Japanese advance, and yet one man refused to accept defeat: Conrad Helfrich. He chose a risky strategy, not a desperate defense, but constant, hard-hitting counterattacks at sea. Submarines became his primary weapon. His plan was daring, some called it brilliant, others considered it reckless. What followed became one of the most underestimated naval campaigns of the Second World War in Asia. Was Helfrich a visionary strategist or a man fighting against an inevitable defeat? This is the story of the Dutch submarine war against Japan. Conrad Helfrich was born in 1886 in Semarang, Dutch East Indies, and at the beginning of the 20th century he trained as a naval officer before specializing as a torpedo officer. Early in his career, he already held important positions within the Dutch Navy, both in the Netherlands and the Dutch East Indies. He also taught at the Higher Naval War School. During the 1930s, he grew into a major figure within the naval leadership in the Dutch East Indies. Among other positions, he served as Chief of Staff and later Commander of the Naval Forces. He strongly advocated for a powerful fleet, especially one centered around large artillery ships and battle cruisers that could strengthen the defense of the East Indies archipelago. In 1939, he became commander of the naval forces in the Dutch East Indies. After the outbreak of the Second World War, he became a central figure in building up the maritime defense against Japan. Because resources were scarce and international cooperation remained limited, he often had to improvise. By then, Germany had conquered the Netherlands. A major naval construction program, including battle cruisers, could no longer be carried out because of the German occupation of the Netherlands. Therefore, Helfrich focused on a more flexible strategy. Rapid, short attacks designed to achieve local superiority before withdrawing again. In a sense, it was a form of guerrilla warfare at sea. Submarines played a particularly important role in this strategy. Cooperation with Allied navies, however, proved difficult, partially because large-scale exercises were politically sensitive. The Allies didn't want to provoke Japan. After the Japanese air attack on bases at Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, and Malaya, the United States and its allies declared war on Japan in December 1941. British, Dutch, and Australian Allied commanders had seriously underestimated Japanese military air and naval capabilities. As a result, naval bases in the American Philippines, British Malaya, and Singapore and the Dutch East Indies became vulnerable to Japanese attacks. With outdated submarines and limited reserves, the Dutch tried to slow the Japanese advance for as long as possible before the Allies were eventually forced to retreat to Western Australia. The United States operated 29 submarines stationed near Manila. After this base fell to Japan, the American submarines were forced to retreat to Allied bases in Surabaya on Java and Darwin on the northern coast of Australia. The Royal Netherlands Navy had already been operating submarines from Surabaya since the First World War. After December 1941, 15 Dutch submarines were deployed to defend their own bases as well as British Singapore, where 2 British submarines were also stationed. By early February 1942, the Japanese advance in Malaya continued, and the British withdrew to the supposedly impregnable fortress of Singapore. By February 13th, during the Battle of Palembang, the Allies unsuccessfully attempted to prevent Japan from capturing the important oil port in eastern Sumatra. 2 days later, on February 15th, 1942, Singapore fell. On the night of February 19th, an Allied fleet attacked the Japanese invasion force near Bali in a battle known as the Battle of the Badung Strait. The same day, the Japanese Air Force launched a massive attack on the harbour and airfields of Darwin, Australia, in order to prevent the Allies from using these bases against the planned Japanese invasions of Timor and Java. On February 27th, Japanese amphibious forces assembled for the attack on Java. The main fleet of the American, British, Dutch, Australian Command, ABDACOM, under Rear Admiral Karel Doorman, departed from Surabaya toward the northeast to intercept the Japanese convoy. This led to the Battle of the Java Sea. During the battle, Doorman's combined strike force repeatedly attempted to attack the Japanese fleet. The Japanese, however, repelled every attack and inflicted such severe losses on the Allies that their naval operations in Asia were virtually crippled. Karel Doorman himself was killed in the battle. As a result of this defeat, Japanese ground forces were able to invade Java. Dutch troops, supported by remaining British units, continued fighting for another week, but Japanese superiority ultimately proved decisive. On March 9th, the ABDA forces surrendered. The Americans and Dutch then withdrew from Southeast Asia with the intention of using Darwin as a new base. Upon arrival, however, American submarine commanders discovered that Darwin was unsuitable as a naval base. The harbor was vulnerable to air raids and the town lacked sufficient infrastructure. The submarines subsequently moved to the Exmouth Gulf, but that location also proved unsuitable, after which they ultimately relocated to Fremantle in Western Australia. From there, they would continue the fight against Japan. At the beginning of the war, the Royal Netherlands Navy operated 30 submarines. Some were stationed in Europe, while the rest were based in the Dutch East Indies. After the German invasion of the Netherlands and the bombing of British ports, the Dutch submarine fleet was dispersed across several British naval bases. Submarines that could no longer be used were scuttled, while operational boats were placed under British command. In the Gulf of Siam, 7 Dutch submarines were placed under British operational control. 3 others operated near Borneo under Dutch command. Even before the war, the Netherlands had built special K-class submarines designed for operations in tropical and colonial waters. In addition, there were more modern O-class submarines capable of operating in both cold and warm seas. When war with Japan broke out, 12 K-class and 3 O-class submarines operated from Surabaya. Only 8 of these submarines were relatively modern. The others were technically outdated and required extensive maintenance. Because of wartime necessities, several submarines that had previously been decommissioned were brought back into service. Under Conrad Helfrich, Dutch submarines achieved remarkable successes in December 1941. Dutch submarines under his command likely sank around 20 to 30 Japanese ships between 1941 and 1942, mainly transport ships, supply vessels, and several warships. Most of these successes occurred during the first months of the war against Japan. This earned him the nickname Ship-a-Day Helfrich. The nickname was partially propaganda and exaggeration, of course. A Japanese ship was not literally sunk every single day. Nevertheless, Dutch submarines were strikingly successful during the first months compared to other Allied navies in Southeast Asia. One of the commanders serving under Helfrich was Anton Bussemaker, commander of the Dutch submarine HRMS 016. During the night of December 11 to 12, 1941, he launched a daring attack in Patani Bay of Malaya. The surprise attack, combined with exceptional navigation, resulted in torpedoing 4 Japanese troop transports. The losses, however, were also severe. Several Dutch submarines were lost in combat in the South China Sea and during air raids on Surabaya. Bussemaker's 016 was also lost after striking a naval mine shortly after the attack near Malaya. As the Allies were forced to retreat to Surabaya and Cilacap on Java, the situation became increasingly hopeless. Constant Japanese air attack and the lack of reinforcements made it impossible for the Allies to maintain their position for long. During the retreat, the Dutch destroyed as many installations as possible to prevent them from falling into Japanese hands. Some Dutch submarines eventually escaped to Colombo and Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka, while others sailed to Fremantle in Australia, where they continued operations under American command. On March 2, 1942, Helfrich was ordered by the Governor-General to leave for Ceylon. From that point onward, he spent the remainder of the war in Colombo, serving as Dutch commander of the armed forces in the east. The position was largely administrative and gave him little satisfaction. Tensions also arose with the civilian authorities of the Dutch East Indies, especially Minister van Mook, and with elements of the Royal Netherlands East Indies Army, the KNIL, that formerly fell under his command. The disputes mainly concerned plans by the colonial government to create so-called authority troops and an oil battalion intended to restore the Indonesian oil industry quickly after the Japanese occupation was over. The government also wanted to train large numbers of administrative officials, partially by drawing personnel from the armed forces. Helfrich eventually cooperated, but reluctantly, because he believed these plans conflicted with the demands of Allied warfare and weakened the Dutch position. The Dutch submarine service remained active after the fall of the Dutch East Indies between 1942 and 1945, though on a smaller scale and mostly under Allied command. Dutch submarines such as the HRMS Zwaardvis operated from Fremantle in Australia and participated in broader Allied operations in the Indian and Pacific Oceans. For Helfrich, this period was frustrating, mainly because he had no longer an active operational command and could only observe military operations from a distance. On September 2nd, 1945, he signed a Japanese surrender on behalf of the Netherlands aboard the American battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. Shortly afterward, on October 1st, he arrived in Batavia. Until January 1946, he remained commander of the Dutch armed forces in Indonesia. He strongly supported restoring Dutch authority and rejected any cooperation with Sukarno and the Indonesian nationalists. After the Linggadjati Agreement, he issued an official protest to the Dutch government. He and others feared that the unity of the kingdom would be undermined and warned that they might no longer be able to continue serving in good conscience. They also discussed their concerns with Queen Wilhelmina, but this ultimately led to few concrete changes. Meanwhile, Helfrich had been appointed commander of the naval forces in August 1945, a role he formally assumed in the Netherlands in 1946. Until his retirement in 1948, he helped direct the reconstruction of the Royal Netherlands Navy, particularly in the areas of fleet planning and naval bases. After retiring, he remained politically active in organizations advocating continued ties between the Netherlands and Indonesia. In the end, however, this proved unsuccessful, as the Dutch government recognized Indonesian sovereignty in 1949. Did you know that Helfrich would have preferred Indonesia to remain part of the Kingdom of the Netherlands? Was that even possible? Could the Dutch have won the Indonesian War of Independence? Click here to learn more.